The thermometer read 73 degrees, inside a hole in the ground with no fire burning. Daniel Hayes stared at the glass tube like it had committed an act of betrayal against everything he understood about winter, about survival, about the way the world worked on the Nebraska frontier. Outside, the wind screamed across frozen prairie at 20 below zero. Inside this chamber of earth and timber, warmth pressed against his cold cheeks like a living thing. Sarah Brennan stood near the entrance, calm, as Sunday morning pouring coffee from a pot that sat on a stove gone cold hours ago. Her children played in the corner, barefoot, comfortable, alive in ways that seemed to mock the killing cold just 12 feet of soil away. But this moment, this impossible warmth, this vindication that would silence every doubter and reshape how people thought about shelter on the Great Plains, this moment was still 6 weeks in the future. The story begins earlier, in grief, in desperation, in a widow's gamble that everyone called madness. 6 months earlier, April 1867. Shell Creek ran high that spring. Snowmelt from the distant mountains combined with 3 days of rain turned the normally placid crossing into a churning brown torrent. Thomas Brennan knew the water was too high. His wife Sarah knew it too. But the Henderson family 3 miles east needed medicine, and Thomas Brennan was not a man to let neighbors suffer when he could help. Sarah stood on the bank with Grace, Samuel, and William watching her husband guide the wagon into the current. The horses balked. Thomas urged them forward. The wagon wheels found purchase on the rocky bottom. For 20 feet, it looked like it would work. Then the downstream wheels struck something beneath the surface. Rock or deadfall, nobody would ever know. The wagon lurched. Thomas fought for balance. The current, patient and merciless, found its advantage. The wagon tipped. Thomas disappeared into the brown water. Sarah screamed his name. Grace clutched her mother's skirt. The boys were too young to understand what they were seeing. The wagon tumbled downstream, shedding supplies and hope. Thomas surfaced, once 50 yards down, washed arms reaching for anything solid. Then the creek bent around a cottonwood grove, and he was gone. They found his body 3 days later, caught in a snag 2 miles downstream. Sarah had to identify him, had to look at the man she had shared 12 years with, now cold and broken by the same water that gave their crops life. She touched his face once. Then she turned away and made the arrangements that widows make. Reverend Josiah Crane presided over the funeral at Lone Tree Church. The Reverend was 55, tall and thin as a whip handle, with eyes that held the absolute certainty of a man who had never seriously questioned his own judgment. "The Lord giveth," Crane intoned over the plain wooden coffin, "and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Sarah stood dry-eyed through the service, not from lack of feeling, but from an excess of grief so deep it had gone beyond tears into a kind of numb calculation. Thomas was gone. She had 3 children, under 10. A quarter-section claim that required continuous occupation or forfeiture, and a half-finished dugout that leaked mud every time it rained. After the burial, neighbors gathered with the kind of awkward kindness frontier people showed in the face of tragedy. Margaret Hayes, wife of Daniel Hayes, who owned the spread 4 miles east, took Sarah's hand. "You'll come stay with us," Margaret said. It was not quite a question. "Just through the winter, give you time to make proper plans." Sarah looked at Margaret Hayes, 42 years old, 3 children of her own, living in a sod house with 6-inch walls and a shingled roof that cost $80 in lumber and $20 in labor. A house that stayed barely above freezing all winter, despite burning through 18 cords of firewood at $8 per cord. "I appreciate that," Sarah said quietly, "but I'm staying on my claim." Daniel Hayes stepped forward. He was a big man, 42, with the weathered face of someone who had broken this land with his own hands and expected it to stay broken. "Sarah," he said not unkindly, "a woman alone out here, 3 children. Winter coming, it ain't meant to be a man." Sarah met his eyes. "Thomas and I filed this claim together. It's legal in my name, same as his. I'm staying. And freeze come January, starve come February." Daniel shook his head. "I can't stand by and watch that." What Daniel did not say, but Sarah heard anyway, was that her quarter section bordered good grazing land he had his eye on. A failed claim meant open land. Failed often meant available. "I'll manage," Sarah said. Reverend Crane approached Blackcoat Dusty from the graveside service. Mrs. Brennan, the church board has responsibilities to this community. Children require proper shelter, proper guidance. My children have both, Sarah said. For now, Crane replied. But prudence demands we consider winter. A woman alone cannot maintain a claim. It is not in your nature. Sarah felt anger flare hot in her chest but kept her voice level. Reverend, I'm on my own land harming no one. You harm those children with stubbornness, Crane said. Pride goeth before destruction, Mrs. Brennan. Remember that. The gathering dispersed. Sarah returned to her claim with her children to the half-finished dugout that Thomas had started the previous fall. It was a shallow excavation, maybe 8 feet into a low hillside with a roof of thin sod over cottonwood poles. When it rained, mud dripped through gaps. When the wind blew, cold air poured through the poorly fitted door. That first night without Thomas, Sarah sat outside while the children slept, looking at the stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear prairie air. She was 34 years old. She had buried her husband. She had $300 in savings, 2 cords of firewood, and a claim she could not afford to lose. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A traditional timber cabin would take 2 men a full season to build. She did not have 2 men. She did not have a full season. What she had was November coming fast and children who needed shelter that would keep them alive through a Nebraska winter where temperatures dropped to 20 below and stayed there for weeks. A traditional cabin, if she could even build one alone, would require a quarter cord of firewood per week just to keep the interior above freezing. She had 2 cords total. That meant 8 weeks of heat. Winter lasted 20 weeks or more. The gap between those numbers was the difference between survival and freezing to death in your own home. But Sarah had noticed something the previous winter. On the coldest nights when the wind screamed across the prairie and their breath froze on the blankets, the back wall of the dugout, the wall that pressed into the hillside, stayed strangely warm to the touch. Not hot, just constant. While the exposed walls turned to ice, that earth-backed wall felt almost alive. Thomas had chalked it up to their body heat pooling against it. Sarah was not convinced. She had grown up in hill country Kentucky where her father, James Whitfield, worked as a stonemason. Their family kept a root cellar dug into a hillside that stayed 50 degrees year-round without fire or ice. Potatoes did not freeze in January. Milk did not spoil in July. The earth, her father had told her, had its own memory of temperature. She was 12 when her father had taken her into that cellar in the middle of July. The outside air was 90 degrees thick enough to swim through. Inside the cellar, cool air wrapped around them like spring water. Touch the wall, Sarah girl, her father had said. She had pressed her palm against the clay. It was cool, almost cold, despite the summer heat baking the hillside above. Earth remembers temperature, her father explained. Soaks it up slow, lets it go slow. Don't fight it. Work with it. 6 months later in January, they had gone into that same cellar. Outside, the world was frozen solid. Inside, the walls were cool but not cold. The potatoes sat in bins unfrozen. The milk in crocks had not turned. Same principle, her father had said. Summer cool stays trapped down here. Winter warmth stays trapped down here. Earth is the best blanket you will ever own, long as you understand how to wrap yourself in it. Sarah had not thought about that lesson in 20 years. But sitting outside her inadequate dugout doing mathematics that led only to death, the memory returned with the force of revelation. What if she did not build up? What if she built down? What if instead of fighting the prairie winter with thin walls and endless fire, she partnered with the earth itself? The idea terrified her even as it formed. But here was the truth she had been carrying since the previous winter, a secret she had kept even from Thomas. She had been planning this, measuring the hillside, calculating depths, sketching designs in a notebook she kept hidden. Thomas's death had not created this plan. It had only made it necessary. She thought about telling Thomas back when he was alive, about showing him her calculations, but he would have dismissed it as fanciful, would have insisted on the timber cabin he knew how to build. So she had waited, hoping to convince him slowly. Now he was gone, and the waiting was over. Grace appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, why are you crying?" Sarah had not realized she was. She wiped her face. "Just thinking about your papa, baby." Grace sat beside her mother. At 8 years old, she understood more than Sarah gave her credit for. "Are we going to be okay?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. Yes, but it's going to be different than we planned. Different how? I'm going to build us a house, Sarah said, but not the kind your papa wanted. A different kind. One that will keep us warm without burning wood we don't have. Grace looked at her mother's face in the starlight. People are going to think you're crazy, aren't they? Sarah smiled despite everything. Probably. You ready for that? Grace thought about it, then nodded. If it keeps us warm, I don't care what people think. Sarah spent 3 days calculating. The frost line in Nebraska was 4 feet deep. Below that depth, even in the cruelest January, the earth held steady near 50 degrees. If she could create a chamber at that depth with enough soil around it to act as thermal mass and thick enough insulation above to prevent heat from escaping, the structure would maintain temperature without burning fuel. Human body heat was roughly 330 BTUs per hour. 4 people generated over 1,000 BTUs per hour. In a traditional cabin with thin walls and a leaky roof, that heat escaped immediately. But if that heat soaked into tons of surrounding soil, the soil would store it, hold it, release it back slowly when the air cooled. It was the same principle as her father's root cellar, just scaled up to whole people instead of potatoes. Sarah pulled out Thomas's surveying notes, his measurements of the hillside near the creek. The slope faced south, which meant it caught maximum sun during the short winter days. The soil was clay-heavy, which meant good structural integrity and excellent thermal mass. The location was protected from prevailing north winds by the rise of the hill itself. Every factor pointed to this working, except the factor of belief, except the factor of a community that would call her insane for trying. On October 28th, with frost already silvering the buffalo grass in the mornings, Sarah Brennan picked up a spade and began to dig. Grace stood in the doorway of the old dugout watching. She was 8 years old, serious beyond her years, with her father's dark hair and her mother's sharp eyes. "Mama, what are you doing?" "Making us a home baby." "It looks like a hole." Sarah leaned on the spade, wiping sweat from her forehead. "For now, but you wait. Come January, this hole is going to be the warmest place in Nebraska." Grace did not look convinced. Neither did the prairie wind, which picked up that afternoon and blew cold enough to ache. The work was brutal. Every shovelful of clay-heavy soil had to be carried out, sorted, set aside. Sarah's hands blistered within the first day. By the end of the first week, the blisters had burst and reformed as calluses. Grace helped, when she could, hauling buckets of earth with Samuel. William, only 4, made a game of sorting stones from soil, his small hands busy while his mother dug deeper into the hillside. Sarah worked from dawn until dark, pausing only to feed the children and collapse into exhausted sleep. She was excavating 12 feet horizontal into the south-facing slope. Not a shallow scrape, but a proper chamber, cutting down 4 feet below grade and back into the hillside until she had a space roughly 14 feet wide and 16 feet deep. The design took shape in stages. First, the floor below frost line. 4 feet down, where winter's fingers could not reach, where the earth maintained its steady 50-degree memory, regardless of what hell raged above. Second, the back wall angled into the hill, creating full contact with undisturbed soil. This was not a veneer, but a thermal connection, a marriage between human space and the Earth's geothermal gradient. By the second week, neighbors started noticing. Howard Frost, a carpenter who had built half the claimed shanties in the territory, rode past one morning. He was 50 years old, skilled with his hands, proud of his knowledge. He stopped his horse and watched Sarah dig. "Mrs. Brennan," he called, "what exactly are you building?" Sarah straightened, covered in mud to her elbows. "A house, Mr. Frost." He dismounted, walked closer, peered into the excavation. "That is a hole, ma'am, a hole in the ground." "It is a foundation," Sarah corrected. Frost shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Brennan, I have built structures for 15 years. That is not how you build a house. You build up, not down." "I'm building both," Sarah said. "Down for the living space, up for the roof." "You will suffocate," Frost said flatly. "No windows, no chimney for a hearth. How do you plan to heat it?" "I am not planning to heat it," Sarah said. "The earth will do that." Frost stared at her. Then he looked at Grace, who was carrying a bucket of excavated clay. The look on his face was pity mixed with certainty that Sarah had lost her way to grief. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "winter is coming. You have children to think about. Do not do this out of pride." Sarah did not argue. She thanked him for his concern and went back to work. because arguing would not change his mind. Numbers would, results would, survival would. By the third week, the excavation was complete. Sarah began installing the structural elements. Cottonwood logs for the roof framework salvaged from deadfall along the creek. She could not lift them alone, so she rigged a pulley system using rope and a sturdy branch, levering the logs into position inch by patient inch. Grace watched her mother work with a mixture of awe and fear. One evening, as Sarah was lashing the roof beams together, Grace asked the question that had been building inside her. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" Sarah climbed down from the roof framework. She knelt in front of her daughter, taking Grace's small hands in her own calloused ones. "Baby, I'm scared too," Sarah admitted. "I'm scared this won't work. I'm scared I'm making a terrible mistake. But I did the mathematics. I checked the numbers 100 times. This should work. The earth should hold warmth the way it does in a root cellar." "But what if it doesn't?" Grace whispered. Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Then we'll figure something else out." But Grace listened to me. Sometimes being scared doesn't mean you stop. Sometimes being scared means you're doing something that matters. Grace buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "I miss Papa." "I do too, baby, every single day." "Papa would know what to do." Sarah held her daughter tighter. "Papa taught me to trust myself, and I'm trusting that the earth will take care of us if we work with it instead of against it." The fourth week brought the entrance tunnel. This was the element that made neighbors whisper loudest. Instead of a door opening directly into the living space, Sarah dug a sloped corridor 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, dropping another 2 feet below the main floor. The principle was simple. Cold air was denser than warm air. It sank. If cold air entered through the door, it would pool in this lower tunnel like water in a bucket, never rising into the living chamber. The tunnel would act as an airlock, a thermal buffer. You would descend into cold, then step up into warmth. She lined the tunnel walls with stones hauled from the creek. Sandstone and limestone selected for their density and thermal mass. By day, those stones would absorb ambient warmth. By night, they would release it slowly, keeping the tunnel from becoming an ice chute that would funnel cold directly into her home. Finally, the roof. This was where Sarah's design diverged most dramatically from typical sod house construction. Instead of a thin layer of sod over wooden beams, she built a layered system. First, the cottonwood logs for structure, then willow brush packed tight, then 2 feet of compacted clay mixed with prairie grass tamped down until it was nearly solid as brick, then another foot of loose soil for insulation. Total thickness was nearly 3 feet of earth. That mass would not just block wind. It would absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night, smoothing out temperature swings. It would create a thermal battery above their heads, storing warmth when available and releasing it when needed. Margaret Hayes visited during the 5th week. She brought preserves as a peace offering, but her eyes held worry. "Sarah," she said, watching Sarah compact clay onto the roof, "this is madness. You're burying yourself and those children alive." Sarah did not stop working. "I'm building shelter that will keep them warm, Margaret. There's still time to change your mind. Our offer stands. You and the children can stay with us through winter." Sarah paused, looked down at Margaret from atop the roof mound. "And in spring, what then? You file for extension on the claim. Medical hardship. No one would question it." "Daniel would take the land," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe not this year, but eventually." Margaret's face flushed. "That's not fair." "It's not an accusation," Sarah said. "It's just reality. Good grazing land is valuable. A widow's failed claim is available. I don't blame Daniel for wanting it, but I'm not giving it up." Margaret left without saying goodbye. Sarah went back to tamping clay. Her hands bled. Her back screamed, but the roof grew thicker. The 6th week brought the final elements. A ventilation shaft near the roof peak angled to catch prevailing winds and create a gentle draw. Fresh air could enter through the tunnel, circulate through the chamber, and exit through the shaft without creating drafts. It was passive ventilation, no dampers or mechanisms, just geometry and pressure. On November 18th, with the first real cold snap settling over the prairie, Sarah moved her family inside. The shelter was not finished. The door was rough-hung. The interior walls were bare earth. But the temperature outside had dropped to 25 degrees, and the old dugout was no longer safe. Grace carried the blankets. Samuel and William carried tin dishes and the family Bible. Sarah carried the lantern and the small iron stove she would use for cooking, not heating. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, like sealing a tomb. That first night, Sarah kept the stove burning low to cook soup. The children sat close together, bundled in coats just in case. The temperature inside, measured by Thomas's old thermometer, read 62 degrees. Outside, it was 25 and dropping. "Mama," Grace said quietly, "what if the roof falls in while we sleep?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "The earth has held up mountains for millions of years, baby. It will hold up our roof." But Sarah did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to every creak of the timbers, every settling sound of the compacted earth above. She listened to her children breathing. She thought about Thomas drowned in spring runoff. She thought about Reverend Crane's warnings. She thought about Daniel Hayes's certainty that a woman could not hold a claim alone. And she thought about her father's root cellar, cool in summer, warm in winter, reliable as sunrise. When dawn came, Sarah checked the thermometer. 58 degrees. The temperature had dropped only 4 degrees overnight. In a traditional cabin, that drop would have been 20 degrees or more. Grace woke and saw her mother's face. "It's working, isn't it?" Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. "It's working." But the real test was still coming. The community had not yet weighed in. Reverend Crane had not yet made his move. And winter, true winter, with its killing cold and endless dark, was still gathering its strength out on the northern plains. On November 20th, Reverend Crane arrived with 2 church elders, Jacob Marsh, a farmer, and Silas Venn, a trapper. They came on horseback, formal and serious. "Mrs. Brennan," Crane called from outside, "we need to inspect the children's living conditions." Sarah stepped out into cold morning air. "You are welcome to come inside, Reverend." The 3 men descended the entrance tunnel. Sarah watched their faces as they entered the main chamber. Confusion first, then disbelief. The space was warm, not fire warm, but genuinely comfortable. The children were playing quietly in the corner, reading by lamplight. The small stove sat cold in the corner. Crane walked the perimeter, touching the earth walls. "No windows, no hearth. This is a tomb, not a home." "It's warm," Sarah said simply. "It's dry. My children are healthy." Elder Marsh frowned. "Mrs. Brennan, this violates basic standards of decent living. Children need sunlight, fresh air." "They get both," Sarah replied. "We go outside every day. The ventilation shaft provides air exchange." "For now," Crane said. "But winter has not truly arrived. When the storms come, when the temperature drops to 20 below, what then?" Sarah met his eyes. "Then we'll be warm inside while others freeze." Crane's face hardened. "Pride, Mrs. Brennan, the deadliest of sins. The church board will convene December 1st. If conditions are deemed unfit, we will petition the territorial court for custody transfer." Sarah felt ice in her stomach. "On what grounds?" "Child endangerment," Crane said. "A mother has duties. One of those duties is providing proper shelter. This is not proper." The 3 men left. Sarah stood in her warm chamber and felt the walls closing in despite their solidity. She had 11 days to prove this worked. 11 days before the church board met to take her children. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat with her calculations spread out on the rough wooden table Thomas had built. The numbers still said this would work. The physics were sound. But physics did not vote on church boards. Physics did not decide custody cases. Grace appeared in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, I heard voices. Are they going to take us away?" Sarah pulled her daughter onto her lap. "Do you remember the story of Noah's Ark?" Grace nodded. "People thought Noah was crazy," Sarah said, "building a boat with no water in sight. They mocked him. They said he was wasting his time. But Noah understood something they didn't. When the flood came, who survived?" "The people in the boat," Grace said quietly. "And when the blizzard comes," Sarah said, "who do you think will be warm?" Grace looked at her mother. Us," Sarah confirmed. "But I need you to trust me for 11 more days. Can you do that?" Grace nodded against her mother's chest. "I trust you, Mama." Sarah held her daughter and stared at the earthen walls that surrounded them. She had bet everything on this shelter. Her claim, her children, her future. In 11 days, the church board would decide if that bet was wisdom or madness. But Sarah Brennan had not spent 6 weeks digging into a hillside to give up now. She had done the mathematics. She had trusted the physics. and she had one more card to play. The next morning, she rode to the Hayes Ranch. Daniel was in the barn repairing tack. He looked up surprised to see her. "Sarah," he said. "Everything all right?" "Daniel, I need to ask you something." He set down the leather he was working. "I'm listening." "Reverend Crane is calling a church board meeting, December 1st. He's going to try to take my children." Daniel's face went carefully neutral. "I heard." "You'll be there," Sarah said. It was not a question. "I'm an elder. I have to be." Sarah took a breath. "Then I'm asking you to do something for me. Bring your thermometer. The night before the meeting, measure your house temperature. Then come measure mine. Same night, same conditions." Daniel frowned. "What will that prove?" "Everything," Sarah said. "You believe in numbers, Daniel. You're a practical man, so measure, compare, then vote your conscience." Daniel studied her face. "You're that confident." "I'm that desperate," Sarah admitted. "But yes, I'm confident the numbers will speak for themselves." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, November 30th. I'll measure both." Sarah rode home through cold that bit at her exposed skin. She had 10 days. 10 days for the shelter to prove itself. 10 days for winter to show its hand. She did not have to wait that long. On December 1st, the morning of the church board meeting, Sarah woke to a changed world. The air pressure had dropped. The sky was heavy with clouds the color of old bruises. The wind had shifted to the north, bringing cold that felt like knives. Grace appeared beside her mother's bed. "Mama, the air feels wrong." Sarah pulled on her coat, stepped outside. The temperature had already dropped to 15 degrees and was falling fast. Snow would come by afternoon. A storm was building, the kind that killed cattle and froze wells solid. "We need to go to town," Sarah said. "If we don't show up for the meeting, Crane will say we're hiding." "Mama will freeze on the road." Sarah looked at her daughter, 8 years old and already understanding the stakes. "If we don't go, they'll take you away anyway. Better to face them on our feet than hide and lose by default." They left Samuel and William with Margaret Hayes, who took them reluctantly, worry carved into every line of her face. Sarah and Grace rode toward Lone Tree Church as the temperature continued to fall. 30 degrees, 25, 20. The wind picked up, pushing them sideways. They arrived at the church to find other families gathering, all looking at the darkening sky with growing alarm. The church was a simple wooden structure, uninsulated, heated by a single cast iron stove that roared at one end. Reverend Crane stood at the front, 6 board members seated behind him. Daniel Hayes was there, thermometer visible in his coat pocket. Howard Frost, Jacob Marsh, Silas Venn. 2 others Sarah knew by sight but not name. The church filled. Everyone knew why this meeting had been called. Everyone had an opinion about the widow Brennan and her hole in the ground. Crane called the meeting to order. "We are here to determine if Sarah Brennan is fit to maintain custody of her children, given her current living situation." Sarah stood. "I'm here to present evidence." Confusion rippled through the board. This was not a trial. This was meant to be a judgment. "Mrs. Brennan," Crane said, "this is not the format for—" "I have recorded temperatures daily," Sarah interrupted, pulling out her notebook. "My shelter maintains 65 to 70 degrees without fire. Can anyone else in this room claim that—" Howard Frost leaned forward. "Numbers on paper don't keep children warm, Mrs. Brennan." "Then come measure it yourself," Sarah said. "Tonight. All of you, bring your thermometers. Compare your homes to mine. Then tell me which children are safer." The church went quiet. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. Someone near a window said, "Storm's coming." As if summoned by prophecy, wind slammed against the church. The building shuddered. A shutter tore loose and banged against the wall. Crane tried to maintain control. "This matter is too urgent to postpone based on weather." Another gust hit. Harder. The stovepipe rattled. Snow began falling, thick enough to obscure the view through the windows. Families looked at each other. Daniel Hayes stood. "Reverend, people need to get home. Now, Paso." "This meeting is not concluded," Crane insisted. But it was. Families were already moving toward the door, urgency overriding deference. The storm had arrived early, and every minute of delay was another mile of dangerous travel. Sarah grabbed Grace's hand. They pushed out into wind that stole breath from lungs. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees. Snow flew horizontal. Visibility was already down to a few dozen feet. The ride home was a nightmare. Grace clung to her mother's back. The horse fought the wind. Sarah could barely see the trail. Only the creek, when they crossed it, told her they were close. They stopped at the Hayes place first to get the boys. Margaret met them at the door, face white with fear. "Sarah, stay here. Don't be foolish." "I need to get home," Sarah said, collecting Samuel and William from where they huddled near the stove. "You'll die out there," Margaret said. "We'll be fine," Sarah replied, though she was not certain of anything except that her shelter, her gamble, her mad excavation into a hillside was the only place she wanted to be when this storm hit with full force. The final quarter mile took 30 minutes. Sarah could not see her own hand in front of her face. She navigated by memory and prayer. When her horse finally stopped at the entrance to her shelter, Sarah nearly wept with relief. She got the children inside first, then the horse into the small lean-to she had built against the hillside. Then she sealed the heavy timber door against wind that sounded like the end of the world. Inside, the temperature read 68 degrees. The children were shaking from the brief exposure, but warming quickly. Sarah lit the small stove to make hot soup, not for heat, but for comfort. Grace helped her brothers out of their wet coats. Samuel asked, "Mama, why is it loud outside?" "That's the wind, baby." "But it can't get in. The earth won't let it." And it was true. The storm raged. The temperature outside plunged. But 12 feet into that hillside, surrounded by tons of soil that held summer's memory in molecular bonds, the Brennan family stayed warm. Sarah thought about Daniel Hayes burning wood desperately in his sod house, about Howard Frost watching ice form on his cabin walls, about Reverend Crane so certain that God's natural order demanded houses built above ground. She thought about the church board meeting interrupted by weather, about the test she had proposed, about 11 days that had become one night for the storm to prove what words could not, one night for the earth to vindicate a widow's desperate gamble. Sarah banked the cooking fire. She checked on each child. She sealed the ventilation shaft partially against the driving snow. Then she lay down on her bed of bundled blankets and tried not to think about what was happening in the world beyond her earthen walls. The wind howled, the storm intensified, and in a shelter that every neighbor had called a tomb, Sarah Brennan and her children settled in to wait for dawn, warm and safe in the embrace of the patient earth. The blizzard struck with the patience of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. December 1st turned into December 2nd with no visible sunrise, only a gradual shift from black to gray in a world erased by wind and snow. The temperature outside dropped past 0, then past 10 below. By midnight of the second day, it had reached 18 below 0 with winds sustained at 40 miles per hour. Wind chill made the air itself a weapon capable of killing explosive fush in minutes. Inside the Brennan shelter, Sarah woke to the sound of absolute silence. Not quiet. Silence. The kind of silence that comes when 3 feet of earth stands between you and a screaming wind, when tons of clay and soil absorb sound the way they absorb cold patiently and completely. She checked the thermometer in the dim light of the banked lantern. 66 degrees, 2 degrees cooler than when they had sealed the door, but holding steady. The children slept under blankets peaceful as any summer night. Grace had one arm around William. Samuel snored softly. Their breath did not fog in the air. Sarah touched the back wall, the one that pressed deepest into the hillside. It was cool to the touch, but not cold. Stable. Exactly as her father had promised Earth would be if you understood its nature. When dawn came on the third day, Sarah noticed something that sent a spike of fear through her chest. William was moving slowly, lethargic. His skin looked pale in the lamplight. "William, baby, how do you feel?" Sarah asked, pressing her hand to his forehead. "Tired, Mama," he said. "Just tired." Sarah's mind raced. Was he sick? Was the air quality degrading? The ventilation shaft was partially blocked by snow. Maybe they were not getting enough fresh air exchange. She watched William carefully through the morning. He ate breakfast, but without enthusiasm, played with his wooden animals, but kept stopping to rest. By midday, when he stood up quickly from sitting, he swayed and his eyes rolled back. Sarah caught him as he crumpled. "William!" Grace screamed. Sarah laid him on the sleeping bench, her heart pounding. She checked his breathing. Regular. His color was returning. After a moment, his eyes fluttered open. "Mama," he said, confused, "you fainted, baby." Just fainted. Grace was crying. Samuel had pressed himself against the wall, frightened. Sarah forced herself to think past the panic. William's breathing was fine. The air did not smell stale. This was not oxygen deprivation. She gave him water, made him drink slowly. After a few minutes, he seemed more alert. "When did you last have water?" Sarah asked. William thought about it. Yesterday, maybe dehydration. He had simply stood up too fast after not drinking enough. But the scare was enough to make Sarah realize she could not simply wait out the storm passively. She had to actively manage their shelter. The ventilation shaft needed clearing. The air needed exchange. And that meant opening the door to the killing cold outside. "Grace," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm, "I need to open the door for a few minutes. Get fresh air in. It's going to get cold in here. I need you to bundle up your brothers, every blanket. Understand?" Grace nodded, fear in her eyes, but trust stronger. "Yes, Mama." Sarah wrapped herself in every layer she owned. Then she climbed the entrance tunnel and pushed open the door. The cold that rushed in was vicious. 20 below zero air poured down the tunnel like water, filling the lower section, then beginning to creep toward the living chamber. Sarah propped the door open with a stick and scrambled back down. The temperature in the living space dropped immediately. 66, 64, 61. Sarah counted 2 full minutes, watching the children huddle under blankets before she climbed back up and sealed the door. Fresh air had come in, stale air had gone out, but the cost was steep. The thermometer read 61 degrees and still falling as the cold air she had admitted spread through the chamber. Sarah gathered the children close. "It's going to warm up again. The earth will bring it back. Just wait." And slowly it did. The thermal mass of the surrounding soil, 12 tons of clay, that had been holding 66 degrees of warmth, began releasing that stored heat back into the cooler air. Within 30 minutes, the temperature had climbed back to 63. Within an hour, 64. By evening, it had recovered to 65. The earth had absorbed the shock of cold the way a massive sponge absorbs a cup of water. Barely noticed it, simply integrated it and continued its patient work of maintaining equilibrium. Grace watched the thermometer climb and said quietly, "It really is a battery, isn't it?" "Yes, baby," Sarah said, "a battery made of dirt." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about William's fainting spell, about her decision to open the door, about how close she had come to panic instead of assessment, about how survival was not just physics, but also judgment, observation, the willingness to act when action was needed. She thought about all the ways this could have gone wrong, and about all the ways it was against every prediction going right. By the 4th morning, the wind had died. The change woke Sarah before dawn. She had grown so accustomed to the muffled roar that its absence felt wrong, ominous. She climbed the entrance tunnel and pushed open the door. Snow had drifted high against it, and she had to dig for 30 minutes before she could force it open enough to slip through. The world outside was alien, every familiar landmark buried or reshaped by wind. Drifts reached 4 and 5 feet deep. The sky had cleared to a blue so sharp and cold it seemed to cut. The sun was brilliant, but gave no warmth. The temperature, by Sarah's estimate, was still 5 or 10 below zero. Smoke rose from the haze place to the east. Thin and desperate, the smoke of a fire burning its last fuel. No smoke came from the Hutchinson cabin to the south, which could mean they had run out of wood entirely or something worse. Sarah made a decision. She climbed back down into the shelter. "Grace," she said, "I need to check on the Hutchinsons. You're in charge while I'm gone." Grace's eyes went wide. "Mama, it's still so cold." "I know, but if they're in trouble, I need to help." Sarah pulled on every warm layer she owned. "Keep your brothers inside, keep warm. I'll be back before dark." The journey to the Hutchinson claim was only 200 yards, but it took Sarah nearly an hour. She broke trail through chest-deep drifts. The cold bit through her layers within minutes. By the time she reached their cabin, her face felt frozen. The door was stuck, ice sealed tight in the frame. Sarah forced it open and stepped into a nightmare. The interior temperature was maybe 20 degrees. Everything was frozen. The family huddled together under a pile of every cloth item they owned. Mrs. Hutchinson's hands were frost-bitten black on the fingertips. The children were hypothermic, their lips blue, their breathing shallow. Mr. Hutchinson looked up at Sarah with eyes that held no hope, only the dull acceptance of someone waiting to die. Get up, Sarah said. All of you. You're coming with me. Mr. Hutchinson shook his head weakly. Can't. Too cold to move. You don't move, you die here, Sarah said flatly. My shelter is warm. 70 degrees, no fire. You want to live, you come with me now. Mrs. Hutchinson started crying, which was almost worse than her silence. How? She whispered through cracked lips. I'll explain when you're warm. Now get up. It took 20 minutes to get them dressed in their frozen coats, another 30 to make the journey back to Sarah's shelter. Mr. Hutchinson carried the youngest child. The oldest boy, Billy, walked on legs that barely functioned. Sarah supported Mrs. Hutchinson, who could barely stand. When they descended into the entrance tunnel, the change was immediate. Cold air pooled at the bottom of the sloped corridor, but as they stepped up into the main chamber, warmth enveloped them like a benediction. The Hutchinson family stopped, stared. Billy's mouth fell open. Mr. Hutchinson set down his youngest child with shaking hands and touched the wall as if to confirm it was real. My God, he breathed. It's warm. Sarah's thermometer read 66 degrees. To people who had spent 3 days at 20 degrees, it felt like summer. Grace appeared with blankets. Samuel brought tin cups. Sarah put water on the stove to heat, not for warmth, but for hot soup to get into Mrs. Hutchinson's system. The woman's frostbitten fingers would need attention, but first they needed to warm up slowly, carefully, without shocking their systems. Billy Hutchinson stood in the center of the chamber, looking around with an expression of complete bewilderment. He had called Grace's home a hole for rats. He had mocked her in front of other children. Now he stood in that hole barefoot and warming, while his own cabin remained a tomb of ice and exhausted fuel. Grace approached him with a blanket. Want to read with us? She asked simply, without triumph. Billy took the blanket. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry I said those things. Grace shrugged. You didn't know, now you do. Mr. Hutchinson sat heavily on one of Sarah's rough benches. How? He asked. There's no fire. How is this possible? Sarah knelt beside Mrs. Hutchinson, examining her frostbitten fingers. The earth does it. The soil around us holds warmth from summer. Our body heat adds to it. The thick roof keeps it from escaping. It's just physics, Mr. Hutchinson. Same principle as a root cellar. But nobody builds houses this way, he protested. They do now, Sarah replied. The sound of a horse outside brought everyone's attention to the entrance. Heavy footsteps in the tunnel. Then Daniel Hayes appeared covered in snow, face raw from cold. He stopped in the doorway and stared. His eyes went to the Hutchinson family warming themselves in the comfortable air, then to the children playing calmly in the corner, then to the cold stove, then to the thermometer hanging on the wall. 73 degrees. The extra bodies and the cooking fire had raised the temperature. Daniel pulled off his hat slowly, walked to the thermometer, studied it like it was written in a language he could not quite read. He pulled his own thermometer from his coat pocket, the one he had brought as part of his recovery kit. He held it up away from his body heat and waited. The mercury climbed, settled, 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel Hayes stared at the glass tube like it had personally betrayed him. How, he said, finally his voice barely a whisper. Sarah poured coffee from the pot on the stove. The earth does it, Daniel, just like I said it would. He took the cup she offered but seemed unable to process what he was holding. The shelter was warm enough that the coffee was almost unnecessary. Our place got down to 38 inside. We burned through more than a cord in 3 days. Margaret's hands are frostbitten from cooking. The children slept in coats and still shivered. He sat down heavily. What's the exact temperature in here right now? You just measured it, Sarah said gently. 73 degrees. Daniel set down his thermometer and put his head in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I told you this was madness. I told Margaret you were condemning those children to freeze. You believed what you knew, Sarah said. I should have listened, Daniel said. He looked up at her and Sarah saw something break in his face. The certainty, the assumption of knowledge, the paternalistic conviction that he knew better. How long can it hold like this? Don't know yet, Sarah admitted, but it's been steady, dropped to 64 during the worst of the storm. But it came back up after. I think as long as we're living in here, our heat feeds into the soil and it just stores it, releases it back when needed. Daniel stood and walked to the back wall, pressed his palm against the packed earth. It was cool but not cold. Solid. He turned back to Sarah, and when he spoke, his voice held wonder. You're living inside a thermal battery, 12 tons of soil at specific heat of zero point 0.2 BTU per pound per degree. That's nearly 5,000 BTU of storage per degree of temperature change. He was working it out as he spoke, the engineer in him finally catching up to what his eyes were seeing. 4 people generate maybe 1,000 BTUs per hour. Over 8 hours, that's 8,000 BTUs. In a normal cabin that escapes through walls and roof. But here it soaks into the earth. The earth stores it, releases it back slowly. That's exactly right, Sarah said. Daniel laughed, a sound close to breaking. Jesus Christ, it's just physics. It's been physics the whole time. And I've been doing this wrong for 20 years. He turned to face Sarah fully. I'm sorry, I thought you were mad with grief. I thought you were gambling with your children's lives out of stubborn pride. I was gambling, Sarah said, but I'd done the mathematics first. Daniel shook his head slowly. You solved it in 6 weeks with a spade and a willingness to listen to what the earth could teach. I've built structures for 2 decades and never understood what you understood in 1 season. Mr. Hutchinson was listening to this exchange with growing awareness. So it really works. It's not luck, it's engineering. It's remembering what we forgot, Sarah corrected. People have been building into Earth for thousands of years. We just stopped paying attention. Word began to spread that afternoon. Daniel brought Margaret and their children to see. Margaret descended into the shelter with visible skepticism, but that skepticism lasted about 30 seconds. She stood in the center of the chamber, feeling the warmth on her frostbitten hands, and started to cry. It's not possible, she said, even as her body absorbed the evidence that it was. Daniel put his arm around his wife. It's physics, Margaret. It's been possible all along. We just didn't see it. Margaret turned to Sarah with tears still wet on her face. Forgive me, I thought you were gambling with your children's lives. I thought you were being stubborn and prideful. You were trying to protect them, Sarah said. There's nothing to forgive. I told people you were burying them alive, Margaret whispered. I said terrible things. You believed what you believed, Sarah replied. Now you know different. That's all that matters. Howard Frost came the next day. He brought his own thermometer, trusting his instruments more than anyone's word. He measured 71 degrees inside, while outside it was still 2 below zero. He examined every aspect of the construction with the detailed eye of a master carpenter. He took extensive notes. He asked Sarah to explain each design choice, and she walked him through the entire system. When he was finished, he sat on a bench and was silent for a long time. I've built 40 houses in this territory, he finally said. Yours is better than all of them. It's not mine, Sarah said. It's just understanding what the earth can do. Frost looked at her with something like pain in his eyes. I need to tell you something. I called this a hole. I told people you were living like an animal. I said your children would freeze or suffocate. I was wrong about every single thing. You're here now, Sarah said. That's what matters. No, Frost insisted. It matters that I was wrong. It matters that I have built houses for 15 years using principles that are inferior to what you discovered in 6 weeks. It matters that I didn't listen when I should have. He stood up, decision forming in his eyes. I'm going to build one. Next spring, for my family. Will you help me understand the principles? Sarah nodded. There's nothing secret about it. Just dig deep, roof thick, work with the earth instead of against it. And I'm not building traditional cabins anymore, Frost said suddenly, his voice firm. From now on, only earth-sheltered. Or I don't build at all. I can't, in good conscience, charge people for inferior design when I know better exists. Sarah felt something shift in that moment. This was no longer just her survival strategy. It was becoming knowledge. It was becoming legacy. Over the next week, as the temperature slowly moderated and the snow began to settle, a stream of visitors came to the Brennan shelter. The Henderson family, the Yates family, the Mallisters, the Schmidt family whose name no one could agree on how to spell. Each came skeptical. Each left planning their own earth shelter. The numbers were undeniable. Sarah's shelter maintained 70 degrees with virtually no fuel cost. Traditional cabins struggled to maintain 40 degrees while burning cord after cord of expensive wood. Sarah's children were healthy and comfortable. Children in cabins coughed and shivered despite being wrapped in every available blanket. But one man still resisted. Reverend Josiah Crane appeared at Sarah's shelter on a cold afternoon in mid-December. He came alone, no elders to back him up this time. He descended the entrance tunnel with visible reluctance as if entering some unholy place. Inside he found Sarah teaching Grace and the Hutchinson children mathematics using stones and scratch diagrams in the dirt floor. The temperature was 72 degrees. The small stove sat cold. Crane stood rigid, taking in the scene. The warm air, the healthy children, the evidence that contradicted everything he had predicted. "Mrs. Brennan," he said stiffly, "I've come to see conditions for myself." "You're seeing them, Reverend," Sarah replied calmly. He walked the perimeter, touching walls, examining the construction. His face was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. This worked. Against all his certainty about proper homes and God's natural order and women's proper place, this actually worked. "You've proven more resourceful than expected," he said finally, the words clearly costing him something. "I've proven the earth is reliable," Sarah corrected. "Nothing more." "The church board will still need to convene," Crane said, "to formally assess the situation." Sarah set down the stone she had been using to demonstrate division. She stood and faced Crane directly. "Reverend, with respect, my children are warm, healthy, and educated. I've broken no laws. The only thing I've broken is expectations." "Expectations exist for reasons," Crane said, his voice taking on the sermonic tone he used from the pulpit. "Order, structure, proper roles for men and women. When we abandon these things, we invite chaos." "A woman's role is caring for her children," Sarah said. "I'm doing that better than most men could in my situation." Crane's face reddened. "You speak out of turn, Mrs. Brennan." "I speak truth," Sarah replied. "And Reverend, I'm curious about something. Your church land borders mine to the west, doesn't it?" Crane went very still. The children had stopped their work, sensing the tension. "The church owns that parcel, Kess," Crane said carefully. "And wouldn't my claim make a fine addition to church grazing land?" Sarah asked quietly. "Especially if a widow failed to maintain it through winter and the land became available." The silence in the shelter was absolute. Even the children seemed to hold their breath. Crane's mask of righteous concern cracked just slightly. "This conversation is inappropriate, Mrs. Brennan." "I don't judge you for wanting the land, Reverend," Sarah said. "Land is valuable. Everyone knows that. But don't dress up greed as concern for my children. Don't use God's name to justify taking from a widow what she's worked to keep." Crane's face went from red to white. He turned toward the exit, but at the entrance to the tunnel he stopped and looked back. His eyes were cold now, all pretense of pastoral care gone. "You may have survived winter, Mrs. Brennan," he said, "but pride still cometh before a fall. Remember that." "Then I'll be sure to stay humble, Reverend," Sarah replied. "The earth teaches humility every day. It teaches that we're small, but it also teaches that if we listen, if we observe, if we work with nature instead of against it, we can survive. Even women can survive. Even widows. Even people you thought God had marked for failure." Crane left without another word. After he was gone, Grace looked at her mother with wide eyes. "Mama, you made him very angry." "Sometimes standing up for yourself makes people angry, baby," Sarah said. "Especially people who are used to others being quiet and obedient. That's their problem, not yours." Billy Hutchinson, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "My pa says Reverend Crane has wanted this land for 2 years. Says it connects his grazing parcels." Sarah nodded. "I know Billy, but wanting something doesn't give you the right to take it, especially not by making a woman think she's unfit to care for her own children." That night, Sarah found Grace's journal lying open on the sleeping bench. The entry was dated December 12, 1867, written in careful 8-year-old script. "Today, Billy Hutchinson said Mama was a genius. I told him I already knew that. I think Papa would be proud of us. We are warm. We are safe. The earth remembers just like Mama said. And I will remember too. I will remember that being different is not the same as being wrong. I will remember that Mama trusted numbers more than opinions. I will remember that women can understand earth and physics as well as any man. Maybe better because we listen." Sarah held the journal and let herself cry for the first time since Thomas had drowned in Shell Creek. Not tears of grief now, but of relief, of vindication, of a mother's fierce love for children she had refused to abandon, even when everyone told her to. Outside, the temperature dropped to 15 below as January approached. Inside the shelter, Sarah Brennan and her children slept in shirt sleeves wrapped not in heavy blankets, but in the patient warmth of 12 tons of earth that remembered summer and refused to let winter steal what it had stored. The storm had tested her design. The cold had challenged her mathematics. The community had doubted her sanity. And the earth, that most ancient and reliable of partners, had proven itself worthy of the trust Sarah had placed in it. January came into Nebraska territory with cold that seemed to have no bottom. On the 15th, the temperature dropped to 15 below zero and stayed there for 6 consecutive days. Livestock died in the fields. Wells froze solid despite being dug deep. The air itself seemed brittle, as if the world might shatter from the cold. In the Hayes sod house, Daniel fed the stove every 90 minutes around the clock. They burned half a quart of wood in those 6 days, and the interior temperature never rose above 39 degrees. Margaret kept the children in bed under every blanket they owned. When they had to move around the house, they wore coats indoors. Ice formed on the interior walls in patterns that looked almost beautiful until you remembered what they meant. At the Hutchinson claim, the family had moved in with the Hendersons after their cabin became uninhabitable. The cost of heating 2 families in one structure was astronomical. They were burning through firewood faster than it could be gathered. Howard Frost's cabin hovered at 42 degrees despite him burning wood desperately. His wife's hands, still recovering from frostbite, ached constantly in the cold. His children coughed through the nights, that deep chest cough that spoke of lungs struggling with cold air and wood smoke. But 4 miles west, in a mound of earth that most neighbors had stopped calling a hole and started calling a miracle, Sarah Brennan woke to 70 degrees of steady warmth. She had stopped lighting the stove except for cooking. The children played in light clothes. Grace had taken to going barefoot inside. Samuel and William built elaborate structures with stones and sticks, their games uninterrupted by the need to huddle near a fire. On January 20th, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She invited 12 families to gather at her shelter for what she called a learning session. Not to show off, not to prove anything, simply to share what had worked so that others might survive the winters to come. They came on a Saturday afternoon when the temperature outside was 8 below zero. 27 people crowded into a chamber designed for 4. The temperature rose to 78 degrees from all the body heat. Sarah had to open the door briefly to let cold air in, watching as the temperature settled back to a comfortable 72. "That right there," Howard Frost said, watching the temperature stabilize. "That's what I need to understand. How does it recover so fast?" Sarah pulled out the notebook where she had been recording temperatures and observations since November. "The earth around us is the battery. When we add heat, it absorbs slowly. When we remove heat, it releases slowly. The mass is so large that our presence barely changes it." She walked to the back wall, pressed her palm against the cool earth. "This wall goes 12 feet into the hillside. All that soil stays near 50 degrees year-round because it's below frost line and connected to the Earth's natural temperature. That's our anchor. That's what we're borrowing warmth from." Daniel Hayes pulled out his own notebook. He had been taking notes obsessively since his first visit. "So the depth matters. 4 feet down minimum." "Below frost line for your region," Sarah confirmed. "Here that's 4 feet. Further north it might be 5 or 6. And the roof thickness," Howard Frost added, 3 feet of earth. That's critical. "Insulation and thermal mass both," Sarah said. "It keeps heat from escaping upward, but it also stores warmth during the day and releases it at night. Smooths out the temperature swings." Margaret Hayes raised her hand tentatively. "The tunnel. Why does it slope down then up?" Sarah smiled. "Grace, you want to explain this one?" Grace stood suddenly the center of attention, but no longer shy about it. She had been studying her mother's notes, asking questions, understanding the physics the way children can when someone takes time to teach them properly. "Cold air is heavier than warm air," Grace said clearly, "like how rocks sink in water but wood floats. When cold air comes in the door, it flows down to the bottom of the tunnel and stays there. It can't flow up into where we live because warm air is already there and warm air is lighter." Billy Hutchinson, sitting next to Grace, nodded vigorously. It's like a trap. The cold gets caught and can't escape. Exactly, Sarah said. The tunnel is an airlock. It protects the living space without needing a complicated door system. For 3 hours, Sarah explained every element of her design. She showed them the ventilation shaft and how it created gentle air circulation without drafts. She explained thermal mass in terms simple enough that everyone understood. She talked about her father's root cellar in Kentucky and how observation of natural principles had guided every decision. I didn't invent any of this, Sarah said. Humans have been building into Earth for thousands of years. I just remembered what we'd forgotten. The Schmidt family patriarch, Heinrich, raised a question in heavily accented English. For flat land, no hill what, then? Build up instead of digging in, Sarah replied. Create a berm. Pile earth around a timber frame structure. Same principles. Thermal mass surrounding living space. Thick earth roof. Entrance tunnel. It'll work anywhere the soil has decent clay content. Howard Frost was sketching frantically in his notebook. I'm building one come spring. Larger than this. Room for my whole family proper. But same design principles. I'll help with measurements if you want, Sarah offered. I want to pay you, Frost said. You're not going to, Sarah replied firmly. This isn't mine to sell. It's physics. It belongs to everyone who needs it. Daniel Hayes looked up from his notes. We should meet regular, monthly, share what works, what doesn't. Make this knowledge common property. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. First Saturday of every month, we can rotate houses. The Earth Shelter Building Society, Grace said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. She blushed but continued. That's what we should call it, if we're going to meet and learn together. Sarah felt pride swell in her chest. Her daughter, once ashamed of their home, now naming a society dedicated to spreading its principles. All in favor of the Earth Shelter Building Society, Daniel said, and every hand went up. As families prepared to leave bundling into coats to face the cold, something fundamental had shifted. Sarah was no longer the crazy widow. She was a teacher, a pioneer, someone who had seen what others missed and had the courage to act on it. Howard Frost lingered at the entrance after the others had gone. Mrs. Brennan, I need to say something. Sarah waited. I called this a hole, Frost said, his voice thick. I told people you were burying your children alive. I said you were mad with grief and pride. I was wrong about every single thing, and that shames me. Howard, Sarah said gently, you built the best you knew how with the knowledge you had. Now you have new knowledge. Build better. That's all any of us can do. Frost nodded slowly, then he looked her in the eye. I mean what I said. I'm not building traditional cabins anymore. From now on, only earth sheltered. I can't in good conscience charge people for inferior design when I know better exists. If that means I build less, so be it. But I won't build wrong. After he left, Sarah stood in the entrance watching twilight settle over the snow-covered prairie. The temperature was dropping again, probably headed for 10 below overnight. But inside her shelter, the earth would maintain its patient 70 degrees. She thought about Thomas, about how his death had forced her into this desperate gamble, about how grief and necessity had combined to create something that might outlast both. Mama, Grace called from inside. Supper's ready. Sarah closed the door on the cold and descended into warmth. Spring came slowly to Nebraska as it always did. February brought a brief thaw, then another vicious cold snap, then gradual warming as winter began its slow retreat. By early March, the snow was melting. The creek ran high again, brown with runoff, and Sarah kept the children away from its banks. But spring also brought accounting. Families tallied their costs from the brutal windburn, and the numbers told a story that no amount of skepticism could refute. Daniel Hayes had burned 18 cords of firewood at $8 per cord, $144 in fuel alone. Medical costs for Margaret's frostbite treatment added another 12. The children had suffered 2 cases of bronchitis. Total winter cost approached $170. Howard Frost had burned 22 cords plus furniture worth approximately $30. His wife's ongoing frostbite treatment was expensive. His children's persistent coughs required regular medical attention. Total cost exceeded $200. The Hutchinson family had lost their cabin entirely, burned through their savings, and gone into debt. Sarah Brennan had burned 3/10 of a cord of firewood, all for cooking. $2.40 in fuel cost. Medical expenses were zero. The children had not been sick once. Total winter cost was negligible. Savings compared to her neighbors exceeded $140. Dr. Samuel Whitmore visited Sarah's claim in early April. He was 60 years old, educated in Philadelphia before heading west, and he had seen enough frontier hardship to recognize something remarkable. He examined each of Sarah's children. Lungs clear, no signs of respiratory distress, skin healthy, growth normal. Then he sat back and studied Sarah with professional curiosity. Mrs. Brennan, I've examined 43 children this spring. Most show signs of winter illness, bronchitis, pneumonia, persistent cough from smoke inhalation, frostbite. Your children show none of that. Stable temperature helps, Sarah said. Stable warm temperature, the doctor corrected. And air quality, no wood smoke filling their lungs every day, no extreme cold shocking their systems. This isn't just clever construction, it's public health innovation. He made notes in his journal. I'm writing a report to the Territorial Medical Society. If more families built this way, I'd have half the patients and twice the success rate. By May, 4 families had broken ground on earth-sheltered homes. Howard Frost's design was elaborate 20 by 24 feet with timber framing and plastered walls. But the core principles were Sarah's. 4 feet below grade, 12 feet into hillside, 3-foot earth roof, entrance tunnel, ventilation shaft. The Yates family built a 2-chamber design with root cellar storage below. The Mallisters on flat ground created a berm structure. The Schmidt family incorporated south-facing windows to capture solar heat. Each design was an evolution. Each builder added something new. The knowledge was spreading, growing, becoming something larger than one widow's desperate gamble. By summer, the transformation was visible across the landscape. Mounds of earth appeared where traditional structures had stood. Some families kept old cabins for storage. Others abandoned them entirely. The Earth Shelter Building Society met monthly. Attendance grew. By July 20, families were regular participants. By August, that number reached 30. The change was quiet. No newspaper articles, no government recognition. Just practical people making practical choices based on evidence they could feel. In September, Lieutenant James Morrison of the Army Corps of Engineers passed through mapping the Platte River Valley. He was West Point educated, trained in contemporary engineering, and he stopped his work to examine the earth shelters. He interviewed Sarah at length, taking detailed measurements and notes. His questions were technical, precise. "Ma'am, did you study engineering?" he asked. Sarah smiled. "I studied my father's root cellar in the earth itself. Best teachers I ever had." Morrison made a final notation. "I'm including this in my official report. These structures demonstrate sophisticated passive thermal regulation, using principles not formally documented in architectural texts. This could influence settlement patterns across the territories." "It's just people staying warm, Lieutenant," Sarah said. "It's engineering, ma'am," Morrison replied, "whether you call it that or not." Winter came again in November of 1868. 13 families entered the cold season in earth-sheltered homes. When the first blizzard struck, Sarah monitored temperatures through monthly meeting reports. Every earth-sheltered family maintained comfortable temperatures while burning minimal fuel. Traditional cabins still struggled. The contrast was undeniable now because both options existed side by side. Daniel Hayes, watching his neighbors thrive while his family shivered, made his decision. Come spring, he would build earth-sheltered. By 1870, 22 earth-sheltered homes existed within 20 miles. By 1872, that number exceeded 40. The knowledge had taken root. Sarah Brennan had started with grief, necessity, and a spade. She had built shelter for her children. In doing so, she had built something larger, a reminder that innovation comes from those willing to observe, that wisdom comes from listening, that the earth itself is teacher, partner, and home. But the story does not end there. 29 years later, on a warm June afternoon in 1899, a young woman rode up to what had become known locally as the Brennan Ross homestead. The original earth shelter was still there, expanded now to 2 chambers, still occupied after 32 years. Sarah Brennan Ross, now 67 years old and gray-haired, was working in her garden when the visitor arrived. Her second husband, Benjamin Ross, a stonemason she had married in 1870, was repairing the entrance timber. The young woman dismounted. She looked to be in her early 20s, travel-worn with a determined set to her jaw. that Sarah recognized from her own mirror 3 decades past. "Mrs. Ross, Mrs. Sarah Ross," the woman asked. "That's me," Sarah replied, straightening from the tomato plants. "My name is Catherine Wells. I have a claim west of Willow Creek. I'm a widow." She said it quietly as if confessing failure. Sarah wiped soil from her hands and really looked at the young woman, saw herself at 34, desperate, determined, alone with impossible choices. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said. "Thank you." Catherine took a breath. "I heard about what you built, what you did. I'm facing the same situation. A claim to prove up. Winter coming. No resources. No help." She looked toward the mound of earth with its well-maintained entrance. "They say you were the first, that you proved it works." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Come inside, let me show you what the earth can do." And they descended into the shelter together. After 32 years, it was still cool in summer, warm in winter. The temperature inside read 68 degrees, while outside it was 85. The thick earthen walls did their patient work regardless of season. Catherine walked the perimeter, touching walls, examining construction. Sarah showed her the notebooks, 3 decades of temperature data, observations, refinements. "How did you know it would work?" Catherine asked finally. Sarah sat on one of the benches Benjamin had built, smooth wood worn by years of use. "I didn't know, not for certain, but I knew the earth stayed warm in root cellars, knew it stayed cool in summer. I figured if I could live inside that stability, instead of fighting it with wood and fire, I'd be better off." "People will think I'm crazy," Catherine said. "They will," Sarah confirmed. "They'll call it a hole. They'll say you're burying yourself alive. They'll question everything about you. But it works. It works. I have 32 years of proof. I have children who grew up healthy here. I have neighbors who followed the design and thrived." At that moment, Grace appeared in the entrance. She was 40 now, married with a profession that was rare for women in 1899. She had studied engineering through correspondence courses, apprenticed with an architect in Omaha, and now designed public buildings. "Mom, I finished the drawings for the school," Grace said, then noticed their visitor. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know we had company." "Grace, this is Catherine Wells. She's thinking about building an earth shelter on her claim." Grace's face lit up. "Then you'll want to see the latest designs. We've made so many improvements since Mama's original." She spread out architectural drawings on the table, detailed plans showing cross-sections, measurements, material specifications. 32 years of collective learning distilled into professional documentation. "These are beautiful," Catherine breathed. "They're yours," Grace said. "Take them, adapt them, improve them, then teach someone else." Catherine looked between mother and daughter. "I can't pay." "We don't want payment," Sarah said. "The earth doesn't charge rent. Neither do we." "But why? Why share this freely?" Sarah stood and walked to the entrance, looking out at the prairie she had claimed 32 years ago as a desperate widow. "Because knowledge hoarded is knowledge lost. Because survival isn't a competition. Because every woman who succeeds makes it easier for the next one." She turned back to Catherine. "You know what the real lesson is, not just about earth shelters, about everything." "What's that?" "The earth remembers. It remembers warmth through winter. It remembers cool through summer. It's patient. It's reliable. It doesn't judge or doubt or tell you that you can't. It just does what it does, and if you're willing to observe, to listen, to work with it instead of against it, it'll take care of you." Sarah walked back and took Catherine's hands. "So build your shelter. Trust the mathematics, nor the doubters. And when it works, when you're warm next February while everyone else is burning their furniture, you teach someone else. That's the legacy, not the shelter itself, the knowledge, the willingness to remember what the earth has always been trying to teach us." Catherine's eyes were wet. "Will you help me?" "Don't need my help," Sarah said. "You've got the idea. You've got the plans. That's all you need." "But I've never built anything." Grace stepped forward. "Neither had Mama. She figured it out. You will too." After Catherine left carrying rolled-up architectural plans and 3 decades of accumulated wisdom, Grace sat with her mother watching the sun set. "You changed things, Mama," Grace said. "Not just for us. For hundreds of people." Sarah shook her head. "I just shared what I learned." "No," Grace insisted. "You changed how people think. about building, about women, about what's possible when you trust observation over assumption. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I'm most proud of? What? That you became an engineer. That you took what I started and made it better. Made it professional. Made it knowledge that can spread even further." Grace leaned against her mother. "You taught me that smart beats stubborn. That women can understand earth and physics and mathematics as well as any man. Maybe better because we're not too proud to learn." They sat together as twilight deepened, mother and daughter, in a shelter that had protected them through 32 winters and 32 summers. Outside, the temperature would drop to 60 degrees overnight. Inside, it would remain a steady 68, the earth doing its patient work, remembering, holding, providing. Sarah thought about Thomas drowned in Shell Creek all those years ago, about the desperate mathematics of that first winter, about Grace's fear and trust, about Daniel Hayes's thermometer reading 73 degrees, about Howard Frost refusing to build anything but earth shelters, about 22 families, then 40, then hundreds across the territories, about knowledge spreading like seeds on wind taking root wherever soil was willing. "Mama," Grace said quietly, "what do you want people to remember about all this?" Sarah considered the question. Then she smiled. "That the earth remembers. That if we remember to listen to observe, to work with nature instead of against it, we can survive anything. That innovation comes from necessity. That wisdom comes from paying attention. And that women, when given no choice but to think differently, can change the world." Grace nodded. "I'll make sure they remember." And she did. When Sarah Brennan Ross died in 1906 at the age of 73, her obituary in the Omaha newspaper mentioned her earth shelter in passing. But Grace made sure the story was preserved. She wrote technical papers on passive thermal regulation. She designed earth-sheltered public buildings. She taught young engineers, both men and women, the principles her mother had rediscovered. The original Brennan shelter remained occupied until 1923, 56 years of continuous use. When the last family moved to town, not because the shelter failed, but because their lives changed, the structure was still sound. The earthen walls still solid, the temperature still stable, and across Nebraska, across the Dakotas, across Montana and Kansas earth, sheltered homes stood as monuments to a widow who had trusted mathematics over convention, physics over opinion, and the earth's patient memory over human doubt. The earth remembers. Sarah Brennan made sure people would remember too. And that legacy, born in grief and necessity and measured in degrees Fahrenheit on a thermometer, reading 73 when it should have read 20 below, that legacy endures, not in monuments or official recognition, but in knowledge passed hand to hand, in families warmed through winter, in the understanding that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply remembering what the earth has always known. That survival comes from partnership. That wisdom comes from observation. That the most reliable shelter is the one built in harmony with the patient, eternal rhythms of the earth itself. The earth remembers. Make sure you do too.